Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant. Sugi, I am happy to announce that we have a very unique guest for our show today.
No, hold on. There is no such thing as very unique.
Oh, are we going to do this? Come on, a very unique guest, talent-wise. And this is a extraordinary person, and her observational language have been very impactful in the national discourse.
Okay. Look, you troll. If we're going to have a serious linguist on the show, I don't need you saying a whole bunch of embarrassing stuff in the intro like this. Get your shit together.
Very unique is a compliment. Being impactful is powerful. It means it's good.
Well, as any person even moderately familiar with proper English usage knows, saying very unique is slovenly.
I thought, is that how you say that? I say slovenly. Anyway,
Oh, I
like
guess I say
slovenly?
slovenly.
Slovenly?
Sloppy.
It's a
It's
linguist,
sloppy.
like an actual technical term for bad
It's
usage,
fuckery. It's
which I,
fuckery.
oh, there, we should have just said that. That'll be great. Anyway, this calling me slovenly or slovenly is not the funnest thing you've ever said to me.
Stop it. Stop it. Funnest is also additionally not a word.
Disagree. Disagree. I think you're a grammando
I
and
think it's
not a
grammar.
cuddly, friendly, wordy like me. However, you don't have to take it from me because today we have Anne Curzan on the podcast.
Anne is Geneva Smitherman Collegiate Professor of English, Linguistics, and Education, and an Arthur F. Thurnaw Professor at the University of Michigan. She also served as the Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts from 2019 to 2024. Her newest book, Says Who? A Kinder, Funner Usage Guide for Everyone Who Cares About Words, came out in March. Anne, welcome to the show. Please fix my co-host's usage.
I am delighted to be here, and especially with both of you who clearly enjoy language, enjoy playing with language, and you know I'm not going to correct your usage.
Oh, thank you for not doing that. Although, maybe we'll correct things together. But also your presence made me write the script much more carefully than usual. We're a podcast about literature and politics, and the politics we cover seem to be like in a permanent downward decline state. And I think a lot of people think that about English language, right? But actually, your book, when I was reading it, made me feel like we're in a kind of inventive epoch. Am I right to read it that way?
You are right to read a couple of things in there. One is that lots of people believe that the language is in a state of decline. It is also true that people have believed that for a long time. I'm a historian of the English language, and one of the really fun things I get to do is study how the language has changed over time, over hundreds and hundreds of years. And I study the evolution of people's attitudes about language change, and I collect concerns from bygone eras of what people were upset about 200, 300 years ago. For example, Ben Franklin gave up the verb colonize as bad. And we now think, what was wrong with Ben Franklin? Why was he so upset about that? But we can feel really upset about the verb incentivize today, or
Well,
because
why
you did
was
the
Ben Franklin upset with the verb colonize? Now I want to know.
Ben Franklin was upset about colonize because it was relatively new. He was upset about it for the same reason that I don't particularly like the word impactful, which I noticed that you used in the intro just for me.
Just to
I
make
don't
you
have
happy.
I don't have good grounds for not liking impactful other than aesthetically, I find it displeasing to me. And for the moment, I have opted out, but I can already tell that I'm getting used to it. So the language is always changing. It's part of a living language. And I would say, sure, we're in an inventive period right now, but humans are always being inventive with the language. And luckily, that keeps me in business as a historian of the language.
So let's get back to the mistakes that Whitney made in the intro, which of course
No,
are
we
plentiful.
decided we don't have time for that part. We're going to skip over that. I
Well,
thought we decided to cut that question.
And why is it okay for Whitney to call you a very unique guest when the word unique is singular and doesn't require another modifier? Why is he implying that you would approve of the word funnest? And if I'm a grammando, should I be happy about that?
All right.
I thought it was grammando, Sugi. I'm sorry. You're not even saying it the right way. Well, maybe Anne will tell us how to pronounce it.
Policing me.
I say it the European way.
And I say grammando.
Oh, dang it.
So maybe we should just clarify that for listeners. Grammando, that's a word that was introduced to me by Lizzie Skernick in the New York Times Sunday magazine, and she defines it as someone who is constantly correcting other people's grammar. Really like the term over grammar police or grammar Nazi. And in
grammar commando, that's what I see. That's how I'll remember it. Okay, that's fine.
Exactly. That's, I think, why I say it the way I do. And one of the things that I realized as I was writing the book was that I think every one of us in our head has an inner wordie, actually enjoys language. Think about how many people play Wordle and spelling bee and like to rap and pun. So we have an inner wordie and we have an inner grammando. And that inner grammando is hearing things in language and thinking, ugh, I don't like that. And so I'm talking to everybody's inner wordie and inner grammando. So now if we go to something like unique, which I was taught in school was supposed to mean or meant one of a kind, that was the only thing it could mean, had that singular meaning in it. If you look at actual usage now, and this has been true for decades, its meaning has changed or it has expanded. So it can still mean one of a kind, but it can also mean highly unusual. And once it means highly unusual, then it can be very unique, really unique, more unique than something else, because it no longer means only one of a kind. And I know that some people's inner grammandos are just going nuts right now and saying it shouldn't do that. Language is going to change. And we've had this happen before. If you take a word like decimate, that has a root in it, which is about 10. And it used to mean to destroy or kill 1 in every 10. And now it means to wipe out because words change over time.
Can you get onto the funnest part of this, though? I mean, it's in the title of your book, so I figured it would be okay, or funner at least is.
It is, and there's a chapter called the funnest chapter. I am certainly trying to provoke people by putting funner in the title. I know that people are thinking, what kind of English professor puts funner in the title of her book? And sometimes in introductions of the book, people have said, a kinder, funnier usage guide. And I have to say, nope, I really did do it. I put funner in the title. The story with funner goes back to the word fun itself. The quick version, fun for most of its life in English was a noun, and it still is. We had fun. But in the first half of the 20th century, kids reinterpreted fun as an adjective, and we can see how they did it. If someone says the party was fun, fun is sitting in the same place that an adjective would sit. The party was great. The party was boring. And once kids reinterpret fun as an adjective, then they're trying to make it behave like other one-syllable adjectives. So if you think about smart, smarter, smartest, tall, taller, tallest, wide, wider, widest, you can see where I'm going. Fun, funner, funnest. Kids are going to try to make it regular until some adult says, yuck, funner is a horrible word. Don't do that. And the kid just files it away as some weird exception. They don't know why the adult's upset, but they say, okay, clearly I'm not supposed to say that. What I think is happening right now is that adults are having a less strong reaction to funnest. So that is slipping in first. And then my prediction is that funner will come in behind it.
I like how you're blaming all of these problems on the youngs. That's what we do here. At least I
am crediting the young. I feel like language change is all a celebration of young people.
All right. Well, speaking of celebrations of language changes, the book is organized into chapters about usage issues that often broaden out into sort of larger discussions, which I really love the structure of the way you put it together. And like you, Sugi and I have graded our fair share of student papers and will be doing so again this weekend. I feel this pleasurable jolt of recognition each time you run upon an issue that I've had to deal with, in so many of these papers. And so there's no way to go through every single chapter in this book. What people should do is buy the book and read it. But I thought that Sugi could go through and pick out our favorite issues that really chimed a bell for us, and ask you to sort of take us through your analysis of that particular chapter. Sugi gets to go first.
All right. So I was really interested in the chapter about the perceived danger of danglers. I have a friend from high school who he and I edited a high school newspaper together, and he had a very particular thing about danglers. And I, for whatever reason, can't remember his particular preference about danglers. So maybe once a year I text him and I have him explain it to me again, and then I forget. I can't, I'm reading student papers and I can't remember it. And he sort of blames journalism for the spread of danglers. Anyway, can you talk about the danglers?
I would love to talk about the danglers, and what a great way to step into it. One of the things I like about danglers is that it is a nice example of when some of the rules about written language can actually be helpful. One of the things I do in the book is take some of the rules we learned, for example, don't end a sentence with a preposition, and I say that rule has never been well-founded. It's just not a useful rule. But the rule about danglers in writing actually is potentially helpful. So a dangler, for whatever reason, I still remember this sentence from when I learned about this in about 5th grade. And the sentence is, clinging to the side of the aquarium, Mary saw a starfish. Now, if you're giggling right now, that is because you hear the dangler, which is clinging to the side of the aquarium, Mary. So there are technical reasons why people would say that sentence suggests that Mary is clinging to the side of the aquarium because the modifier is sitting right next to Mary. Now, when we hear that in speech, we're probably not going to interpret it that way, because in real life, we know that odds are that it's the starfish that is clinging to the side of the aquarium and not Mary. But one of the things that's really hard about writing, and I wish someone had told me this when I was an emerging writer, is that writing is hard in part because it cannot tolerate the level of ambiguity that speech can. We are ambiguous in speech a lot, and context helps us, or the confused look on someone's face helps us, and we clarify. But in writing, we don't get to be as ambiguous because we're not there to clarify. So the rule is that you should put the modifier, be that clinging to the side of the aquarium or grading papers this weekend, comma, I, because you are the one grading papers, as opposed to grading papers this weekend, the papers just put me to sleep. Now, somehow the papers are grading themselves? Probably not. So that's a rule that I actually think can be helpful for us as writers.
Thank you for that one. That is one that I do encounter quite a bit. My one has a little bit to do with politics, which we're going to be moving into in a second here. But it was later in the book, in chapter 27, you talk about bequeathing capital letters, which made me think about the way that the Trump campaign and his, including not just Trump, but his press people randomly capitalize stuff in their press releases. And then I read this chapter and I'm like, oh, people used to do this all the time, including the way that the Declaration of Independence is written is this way. And I started to think, well, maybe I shouldn't be so mad about that. I don't know. You go from there.
I think the history of capitalization is such an interesting one. In the ways it shows us how much variation there's been. As you note, when you go back to documents like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, you see all of these capital letters in places where now we would be told not to put capital letters. And I don't know if people just say, oh, well, it's an old document, whatever. But at the time, there were people who were arguing that capital letters should not only be used at the beginning of a sentence, which they still are, and for proper names, but that they should also be used for important nouns. So if a noun was important, you capitalized it. And as you note, Whitney, I think we still see that sometimes, especially in more colloquial writing, that people will capitalize nouns that they think are important. Now, there are some rules in current usage guides about capitalization that, as I say in the chapter, make no sense to me. So I was the dean for 5 years at the University of Michigan. And the way we talk about capitalization now and the rules we have would say that you capitalize dean when you say Dean Curzan. But if people said, I was meeting with the dean, and they meant me, you would not capitalize dean. This makes no sense to me, but it is the
I'm
rule
struggling
that
with
we.
this right now because I have like police officers in the book that I'm working on. So I'm trying to, I have to remember, is this lieutenant capitalized? Is this captain capitalized? It's the same issue that you're talking about right now, right?
Right. And that if we talk about President Biden, it's capitalized. If we talk about the president, even when we're talking about Biden, it's not capitalized. Why not? Why can't I capitalize it? I would like to capitalize it.
I guess
So
it's
how,
interesting. Like
oh,
I
go
I
ahead, Sue.
reflexively do not want to capitalize it. And then I'm like, but why? And I'm like, oh, right, because in my late teens, I was forced to memorize the Associated Press style guide. Um, and so I
That's
just think that everything the AP says is correct. Like to this day, I will go through academic things I write, including like a script that, if we're writing questions for a guest and it says percentage, I'll go in and take out, like I'll edit my emails to be in AP style, and there's no good reason for it. And then on the other hand, I wrote a novel, right, that has like capitalization in it. And for years after I published that novel, I would get people, friends of mine, writing to me using the grammatical stylizations of that novel, which included a lot of colons, capitalization of certain nouns as sort of like a gentle, friendly mockery of that style. Like New York Magazine even did it in their review of the book. And it was like, do you really think that needs to be capitalized?
So I want to ask, you have a thing at the end of each chapter, you say the bottom line, right? And then we get the like sort of, so on this one, if I'm referring to a certain lieutenant and it's known who I'm talking to, but I don't say his name, I just say lieutenant. The lieutenant ran over there. Do I capitalize or not capitalize that lieutenant?
Well, it depends how rebellious you want to be. If you want to make the copy editors at the press happy, I would say don't capitalize it and then they won't try to correct you. But if you want to try to bring in a new rule on this, then you can try capitalizing it and get in a fight with your copy editors. You can only imagine what it was like for the copy editors who were copy editing my book. And at one point, they tried to change something, and I said, I really am not going to change that. And then, of course, I actually put it in the book of the copy editors tried to change this, and here's why I wouldn't let them change it.
I had a word once that I used that they really didn't want me to use in my very first novel. It's a word called adunc is the word, ADUNC, and it means inward curving. And they used to describe a person's face, and they were like, "This is not a word." I'm like, "It is," and it was a word. And so we had to go back and forth, and I'd find it in various places. But anyway, it's fun. Copy editors are good people, but they can
They're
be stubborn.
wonderful people.
My God, with our luck, Benjamin Dreyer will listen to this episode and we'll get like that's the former copy chief of Random House, who has also written a book about copy editing. I would love to, yeah. My dream is to hear the two of you debate stuff. Although I suspect maybe you would often agree, but it seems to me like part of what you're pointing to is just like, right, consistency. Like if you make a rule for your book, you can make a rule for your book, then you just have to follow it. Like that, what they often ask me for is like, what is your style guide, Sugi? And then I'm forced to understand that like I'm like, oh, I do actually have an internal style guide. And here are places where I've violated my own rule.
Well, Sugi, I love that point because I think it is what I would like us to be talking about rather than some notion that there is one correct way to use the language and many incorrect ways to use the language. We can talk about, first of all, are we adhering to an external style guide? Is it what the style guide would say? But we also should be talking about who is your audience? What is your purpose? What rhetorical effect are you trying to have? And that as a writer, you get to make decisions about, am I trying to surprise people with the way I'm using a word or the way I'm using capitalization? Or am I not wanting to surprise them and use it in a more standard way? And those are choices. And as an English professor myself, I want to be empowering students to feel like they get to make choices too.
So, I mean, underlying a lot of this, and as Whit mentioned in the opening, right, this is partly about power and who gets to have it. Usage is and can be political, and the politics of usage comes up frequently in your book. And I wonder if you would talk to us about the political aspect of usage and read a section about that from the book.
Sure, I'd be happy to read, and I can read from chapter 4, which goes after the question of quote unquote PC language and why emotions run so high about this. It is also one of the fascinating things about the work I do is that language matters and the words are powerful. It's actually one of the most powerful tools we have is language. It can heal and it can harm. It can inform and it can disinform or misinform people. So I wanted to address that in the book because sometimes usage rules can feel like this is just surface level stuff, but language is powerful, and a lot of what we're negotiating here, Sugi, as you mentioned, is power and who gets to set those rules. So I'm happy to read a section from chapter 4. Debates about language are almost always about more than language. In this case, debates about inclusive and sensitive language are about who has the power to call the linguistic shots, about what language is and isn't inclusive and sensitive. It's fundamentally a power struggle between groups that have historically held most of the political, economic, and social power, what I'm going to call having the biggest microphone, and historically marginalized groups whose voices are becoming more and more centered in the broader public discourse. It's not that some of the language that today is deemed offensive is newly offensive. It's that the people who have been denigrated by this language have gained more power to call the language out as offensive. They have a bigger microphone than they have had in the past. This fundamental power struggle about who gets to call the shots is obscured by the argument that it's only in the past few decades that language has been politicized. Many people understandably want to believe that throughout its history, language has been a neutral medium and that it recently shifted. In this view, language was a neutral conveyor of a message, not the message itself, and then historically marginalized groups started politicizing the language by asserting what language they found offensive and inoffensive. But here's the thing, the language has never been neutral. As speakers, we are always making choices about what language to use, both speaking and writing. Consider as just one small example, politeness conventions. You might want to say, "Give me that dinner reservation at 8." But in all likelihood, if you actually want to get a reservation at a busy restaurant, you would go with something more like, "Could I get a dinner reservation at 8?" I know it doesn't seem like a big difference, but it is. You are respecting the power of the person booking tables to decide whether or not to help you by employing what is conventionally seen as more polite language. This example seems mundane because we make these kinds of language choices all the time, every day, as part of navigating our social landscape. And power is part of that social landscape. Every day we make choices about how to address others, which is also a negotiation of power. When I go to see a medical doctor, do I call them Dr. Patel? Or can I call them by their first name, given that they are calling me Anne, not Dr. Curzan? It is a kindness to tell others what to call us when there is a structural power difference and we have more power, as it can feel loaded and even scary for those with less power in terms of the potential consequences for getting it wrong. Speakers with less social power, institutionally and/or in a given situation, typically need to be more careful in their language choices. One wrong word and you can lose your job or your life. Don't forget, for example, the horrifying grounds on which African Americans were sometimes lynched in the history of the United States. This is why when people say, "It's just words," as a way to dismiss the power of language, you should be suspicious. Language is powerful. It's usually not just words. Words often have consequences.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about PC language, and now that's also morphed. Like if Ron DeSantis were to talk about this, he would talk about woke language, right? That's become another cover word for the same kind of series of issues, I think. Um,
Yeah.
and in that same chapter, you do this interesting taxonomy of the four like common concerns voiced by people who are complaining about PC or woke language. And I thought it would be helpful just to sort of have you outline those and talk about, their relevance and how you sort of think about responding to them.
Sure. And I've been doing this work for years. And so when I was writing the book, I thought, okay, let's catalog the ways in which people try to argue against inclusive or sensitive language. And so the first argument that I will hear is, but it's always changing. How can I keep up? It's always changing. Now, there's a fair concern here, which is that it does change. What is seen as sensitive or inclusive can change. My reaction is that this is not the only language that changes. For example, if you work in a business context or you are working with jargon, and jargon changes. If you're a young person, you are keeping up with slang. So we are in other areas of our life keeping up with language change because it matters to us. It matters for us to be using the current jargon and getting it right. And so in this case, I say, sure, it does change, but part of respecting people is trying to keep up with that change so that you are using language that is seen as sensitive and inclusive. So the second argument I will hear is something along the lines of, this is silly or this is ridiculous. And often when people make that argument, they will pull out an example that feels ridiculous to them. And often it is a term that is not actually seriously being argued for. So something like person hole cover for
I like that
the,
example.
the sewer cover in the street. Now, I don't know of serious efforts to have that be the name. I think we now say something like street cover or something like that to deal with that term. Or over the years, we heard things like vertically challenged and people saying that's ridiculous. But again, I say, show me the evidence that people are making a serious argument for that. And let's not use those sorts of outlier examples to argue against the whole project of using more sensitive and inclusive language. So then there are two more that I talk about in the book that feel really important. And the third is I want to be and the third is I want to be inclusive and sensitive, but sometimes I get it wrong and people should just know that I mean to be inclusive. And this gets us into intention versus reception. And in that example, someone is saying, it's only my intention that should matter. If I meant the word to be inclusive, then it should be inclusive because I didn't mean any harm. And what I talk about in the book is that intention does matter, but it actually doesn't trump reception. We're responsible for both our intention and the reception, and you should pay attention to the reception. So even if you meant the word inclusively and it turns out that your audience did not interpret it as inclusive, you should take that reaction seriously and figure out, do I want to change my usage so that my language is also being received as inclusive and sensitive? And that gets us to the fourth point, which is concern about being canceled. That if I say something and other people decide it's not sensitive or inclusive, they're just going to cancel me, and that doesn't seem fair. And I get it. And that's where I make a call or a request in the book that we also give each other some grace and space. That when we hear something that strikes us as offensive or insensitive, not to assume that we know intention, but to give someone some space to learn and grow about usage so that they may be able to use language that is interpreted as more inclusive and sensitive.
So related to this, you write in the book about the use of the singular they, There's been a lot of anti-trans rhetoric from the right during this presidential campaign and certainly preceding it as well. And you've felt a little of that. You wrote a 2021 op-ed for the Washington Post about the use of the singular they, which dates back pretty far. And you also got in your inbox what you'd called some stunningly angry email about it. I wish that surprised me at all. So what are your thoughts on that pronoun and why people are so resistant to its use despite its deep history?
Singular they is a fascinating question because it has been generating controversy for quite a long time. I've been working on singular they for over 3 decades now. And in my early work, I was dealing with what I'm going to call gender neutral they. And Sugi, as you note, that usage has a long history in English. We can go back hundreds of years and find examples of this. This would be an example such as someone who knows where they're going should give us directions. Someone, that's singular, gender neutral, who knows where they're going. Or it could be something like a teacher should learn their students' names. A teacher, gender unspecified. That singular they, we've got evidence back into the 1400s. We have it in Shakespeare. There's a whole website dedicated to Jane Austen's use of singular they. What's fascinating is that this usage has been controversial because in the 18th century, grammarians corrected it and said, don't use singular they, use he as a generic. And I don't know about both of you, but when I was in junior high school and even part of high school, I was taught to use singular he, which didn't feel very
I don't
inclusive.
remember that. I don't, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, you can find it in Strunk and White in much of the 20th century that singular he is never wrong. But then we moved on to he or she, which is clunky and also not fully inclusive. So I've been arguing for singular they because the question isn't, can they be singular? Which I often found myself in arguments with people where they would say, it can't be singular. And I would say, but it is. And they would say, but it can't be. And I would say, but it is, which is not a very interesting argument. If you look at usage, it is singular. It's been singular for a long time. People who say a pronoun can't be singular and plural at the same time, I say, okay, back up. Let's talk about you, which is, of course, both singular and plural at the same time in English. You are singular, you are plural. So the question was, why can't we write down singular they? And the answer was because style guides told us that we could not write it down. And then in the 21st century, we had they expand in usage to be a non-binary pronoun or a pronoun that some transgender individuals use. And what's been fascinating to me is that usage is what has changed style guides. So in 2015, when the Washington Post changed its style guide to include singular they, it was in large part to respect the pronouns of non-binary and transgender individuals. And then that long-standing gender-neutral they scooted in with it, but it wasn't what actually changed the style guides. And in terms of the controversy here, I would say it goes back to the issue that language and debates about language are often about more than language. Sugi, as you noted, this is a political wedge issue. People are using this for political purposes. I will say it is worth tracking on the studies of young people. You'll see, I love working with young people, and young people are the movers and shakers of language change. There are now studies showing that for young people who are in context with non-binary peers, peers who use they as a pronoun, singular they is part of their grammar. Now, I will say for me, as someone who is a bit older, I've had to integrate singular, non-binary singular they into my grammar. I have colleagues and friends and students who use they as their pronoun, and I have needed to consciously make that part of my grammar. And sometimes I get it wrong and I apologize. But for young people, it is now part of their grammar if they have peers and teachers who use they. And what's funny is I have had some of them look at me and say, Why do older people find this so hard?
I think it's sort of it's like a muscle memory thing. I don't know. For me,
Yes.
that's how I think about it. I think about it in relation to like a kind of it's like a psychological athleticism, and I don't quite have the elasticity I used to. And I think like one of the other really interesting things about this is that I don't know. I think that my generation, our generation, my generation thinks of identity and gender, like some of us anyway, have regarded it as like a kind of teleological, like a search for an identity, and then you discover it, and then your pronouns are settled. And or maybe it's not your gender identity, maybe it's your ethnic or racial identity or your relationship to like your heritage or some other sexual orientation, what have you. And the other thing about younger users of language is also that like they are quite good at fluidity. So if someone changes their pronouns, like I'm very close to someone who changed their pronouns, and I watched as sort of like other younger people were able to just change, like they were able to sort of be like, oh, right. And then they registered the new pronouns. And so like there's a like a shifting back and forth. Like it doesn't necessarily seem like there's an end point. And so like the entire muscularity of like the ability to shift their language just seems so much like exponentially better than mine. And frankly, I'm just really envious of it. Like the ability to like always trying to keep up. I'm like, and because I think that I mean, it makes sense. And I think it's intellectually interesting. Like, why should there be an endpoint for identity? We had the writer T. Fleischman on the show talking about gender, like one of our very early episodes. And that was maybe one of the moments when I was thinking about it. Um, and just sort of like wishing like if there was an exercise I could do to become better at this, I would do it.
Well, and you're making such an important point about the process of learning language. And it is crucial to how language changes over time, is that young people are growing up hearing different things in the language and internalizing them as part of their grammar. And that is actually just the key. And that is a key factor in language change. I love the description that one linguist has used, that every baby is reinventing the language. They're taking all this input that they hear around them, and then they are figuring out the rules, because nobody says to them, baby, fun is both a noun and an adjective. The baby's just hearing it and saying, okay, I guess it functions as both a noun and an adjective. And here's how one syllable adjectives work. Most of grammar we're learning by figuring out the rules from the input that we hear.
I usually have multiple trans or non-binary students in my classes, and we were just workshopping a story this week in which a writer was talking about romantic relationships in the queer community and wanting to write a personal essay about that. And that writer was sometimes gave friends like they, he, and she as potential pronouns, and then those were and was sort of playfully shifting them through the paragraph. None of the students have any problems using they. The cishet students don't have a problem with it either. But then another another transgender student was saying like, well, should you be changing around within the paragraph, and should you pick one of these options? And we were discussing that. There's no rules for that yet, so that was interesting. Anyway, that's an example of young people, and I think that in the end, what I got from reading your book is like people who are frustrated by this are simply saying, I used to have the power to call these people whatever I wanted, and I didn't have to think about being polite to them.
Yeah.
And now I'm being asked to be polite to them, and I don't want to. And so that's the end of it,
Yeah.
basically.
As you're capturing there are issues of respect here. And when you put on the table, using people's pronouns is about respecting them in the same way that using people's names and getting people's names right is part of respecting them. And we know historically that getting people's names wrong or Americanizing people's names or giving them new names, has historically been a way to disrespect them. Again, a lot of power is playing out in these decisions we're making about what language to use.
Okay, enough about national politics. I want to talk about the politics of usage in the linguistic community, which you also know quite a bit about. You mentioned in your introduction that the American Heritage Dictionary used to have a usage panel, and you were on it, which I consider very cool. But Also on it were people like Antonin Scalia, Will Shortz, Maxine Hahn Kingston, all these famous writers and famous people, and a Supreme Court judge who was very conservative. What was that like? How did everybody get along?
Oh, I wish I could answer that question, because implied in the question is that we actually got together in person and talked about usage, which would have been so
I
much
imagine
fun.
everybody at a big long table,
I
and
know.
there's grapes and some wine, and you guys are eating
And
macadamia
Scrabble,
nuts and talking about language.
definitely playing Scrabble.
Okay.
That's right. There's a whole side table with Scrabble and bananagrams and Boggle, and we can all entertain ourselves. That would have been fabulous. Instead, for the years that I was on the usage panel, and the usage panel was disbanded in 2018, which made me very sad, we annually received a survey, a written survey. When I started, it was on paper and then it moved online, with anywhere from 30 to 50 questions about usage. And so you would get something like fun as an adjective, fun or funnest, and you had four choices. It would give you sentences. And the four choices were completely unacceptable, somewhat unacceptable, somewhat acceptable, or completely acceptable. And you would vote. And I remember talking with the editors of the dictionary, and they said, you know, our sense is that some people just do it over coffee in the morning, just their own preferences. And then some of you, they say, looking at me, as a linguist, are going out and looking at actual usage to figure out what's going on as to how you want to vote on things. So another example, and actually I can ask both of you, is how people are now using the noun hoi polloi.
I, isn't that you just it's for a bunch of people that are, the hoi polloi, the normal people, the rabble. That's how I would use it.
I guess I
Okay.
don't use it.
And that's what many of my undergrads are saying. They're like, yeah, we don't use this term. But it is true. Whitney, you are using it in the historical sense. But what you will find if you look at usage now, including edited usage in newspapers, is you will see it being used to refer to the elite sometimes. And I think it has
Ah.
been infected by hoity-toity.
I like
Oh
that. That's
no.
fun.
So it is either just dying, that is possible, or it is coming to mean its opposite, which words every occasionally do, that it means both the masses and sometimes the elite.
That is very fun. Just have did you guys get to see each other's answers? Do you have any sense of who of your colleagues was the funnest?
We did not. I will say that many years I would imagine Antonin Scalia filling out his ballot, because we know from his opinions that he was fairly conservative about usage. So I would imagine him. I have no idea what he actually did, but I would imagine him checking completely unacceptable for singular they. And then I would check completely acceptable and say, ha, we are canceling each other out. But Sugi, if you look in the online American Heritage Dictionary, if you look up something like singular they or hoi polloi or something like that, you'll find a usage note. And often in the usage note, you will see a history of these surveys. And they will say, for example, with the verb finalize, which in the 60s was seen as horrible bureaucratic jargon, that something like 90% of the panel did not accept finalize in the 60s. And then by the 2000s, you see that it's 30%, then it's 20%. So you can watch peeves dying over time or growing stronger over time in those usage notes.
That's fascinating. So there is a terrifying sentence in your book. And I want to quote it. You write, "There is no such thing as the dictionary. Say it ain't so. I want there to be a dictionary. Is this because dictionaries are no longer profitable?" You mentioned the online version of the dictionary, and thus don't have the same cultural sway in the age of the internet. There's like Urban Dictionary. Um, will dictionaries continue to exist? You talk about this usage panel being disbanded. Um, where does authority lie? We need some sort of gatekeepers. Anne.
Sugi, I love that sentence out of context because it makes it sound so radical. There is no such thing as the dictionary. if we change the intonation a little bit, I think it makes clear what the sentence meant in context. If I were to say, there's no such thing as the dictionary. And what I'm writing about there is the phrase that many of us use. I even catch myself using it. Go look it up in the dictionary, which suggests that all dictionaries are exactly the same. It doesn't matter who edited it, what publishing house it comes from, what year it was edited in. But of course, it does matter. Different dictionaries, different dictionary editors have different philosophies. It does matter what year it was published in terms of whether it will be up to date with particular bits of usage. So there are many dictionaries. There is not one dictionary. Now, your point about the industry is an interesting one because now, again, I don't know for both of you, but when I graduated from high school, which was a while ago, the graduation gift when you graduated from high school, if you were going to college, was a good collegiate dictionary.
Really? Okay.
Oh yeah, I have mine. I got my dad's Merriam-Webster dictionary from 1950, which I've had like I had to have it's down here on the floor, which is probably why I had to have it recovered. But you know, that to me is the dictionary, and that's it. I'm sorry. I've had that one all this time.
Wow. I
Yeah.
suddenly understand so much more about you.
That's why I
Well,
still use hoi polloi.
so if every or almost every high school senior who's going to college is going to get a collegiate dictionary, you can imagine this is a very profitable industry. But as we have gotten online dictionaries, including many of these print dictionaries, Merriam-Webster, American Heritage, which now have online versions, this is no longer a particularly profitable industry. And my understanding is it's part of why the usage panel was disbanded. It takes resources to create the survey, analyze the survey. And so we will continue to have dictionaries. They are very useful. And one of the really terrific things about online dictionaries is how quickly they can be updated in a way that was not possible with print dictionaries. But one of the key points that I'm trying to make in that chapter, which no one ever told me as a user of dictionaries well into college and graduate school, is to remind people of the very human hands behind dictionaries. So dictionaries are a wonderful resource. They tell you a lot about how words mean, but dictionary editors will say, we cannot keep up with you all. You keep changing the language and we are just trying to keep up, and you will always be ahead of us.
It's funny because like your description of like all the different dictionaries, that's also the way we talk about the Bible, right? We just talk about it like there's one Bible or like one edition of Leaves of Grass, or like we're not like in my parents' house at this point, we play so much Scrabble that if anyone refers to the dictionary in the house where I grew up, it's literally the Scrabble dictionary. Um, and this is, I don't know, it's like so personality specific. That yeah, that's a really helpful point.
Well, and when you think about many universities, for example, if you go into a big reading room in a library, they often will have on a pedestal a big unabridged dictionary that's open to a particular page so that you can go up and get answers. And most people don't ever ask, which unabridged dictionary is this? Because it's already open, so people aren't flipping to the front, I think most people, to see what's there. When was it published? How up to date is this thing? But it's put, as you note, in this place of reverence as an authority. And I want to make sure I say they are very authoritative, but they are also human.
I don't know. I think one of the things I'm learning from this interview, Anne, is that you are actually the authority that I want on language. And so we just so appreciate you joining us. And listeners, make sure not to miss this incredibly fun, funnest book, Says Who, a kinder, funner usage guide for everyone who cares about words, which is available at independent bookstores near you. And thank you.
Such a pleasure to get to talk with both of you.